The constitutional principle of nullification rests upon the historical fact that the states formed the federal government and not the other way around. In doing so, the states gave away some of their sovereignty but retained most of it. That historical fact is confirmed and codified in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which provides as a matter of constitutional mandate that the federal government only possesses the 17 limited delegated powers that the Constitution has given to it. Notwithstanding all of this, the feds have slowly worn away at state sovereignty, and the courts have let them get away with it. Today, the feds regulate the air we breathe, the water we drink, the water pressure in our showers, the number of legs on our desk chair, the weight of lobsters we can fish from the sea. The list is endless. Justice Clarence Thomas once opined, as you heard me say, that he wouldn't be surprised if the federal government tried to regulate Tupperware parties. But the courts have also occasionally looked the other way when the states have asserted their nullification rights. And the feds have sometimes looked the other way as well. When the federal government enacted the Fugitive Slave Act, which permitted kidnapping runaway slaves and returning them to their owners, the state of Massachusetts nullified that act and prosecuted those who kidnapped runaway slaves in Massachusetts. Today, the states have nullified the federally mandated time zones and the federal ban on medical marijuana. Thus, the stepped-up efforts by the states to return the federal government to the confines of the Constitution might just scare the Congress into looking the other way. The Constitution does provide that where state and federal law conflict, federal law is supreme, but only in those areas of human activity legitimately granted to the feds by the Constitution. Joining me now to talk about all of this is Thomas Woods, the author of 9 books on freedom in America, including the New York Times bestseller Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and the federal government bailouts will make things worse. Tom, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thanks, Judge, and congratulations on the success of Lies the Government Told You. This thing's selling like crazy.
It is selling very nicely, thanks to you and Lou Rockwell and many of our other friends who've been very kind and generous to me and to the ideas in the book, many of which we share, the principle of which is that the government doesn't recognize limitations on its own power. As you said so nicely, the only limitation that the government recognizes, we're talking about the federal government, is what it can get away with. So what about nullification? What other areas besides things like medicinal marijuana and the time zones? I think Indiana and Arizona told the feds to go take a hike. They would declare their own time in their own states. And we know that 14 states allow medicinal marijuana only because the feds look the other way. But what areas might the states begin to return back to state sovereignty?
Well, I think the easiest ones to do would be ones involving civil liberties, for example, like with the Real ID Act, which met with a lot of fierce state resistance. And secondly, various types of unfunded mandates. I think the health care issue is a little trickier to deal with via nullification. I mean, I'm open to suggestions for people who have been brainstorming about it. But if the federal government has its hand directly in your pocket, it's hard to see how the state can cut that hand off. I mean, it can go to the courts, and it might as well try every avenue that it has available to it. But what I would suggest is that we start not so ambitiously. We start around the edges,
right?
Just to acclimate people to the idea. Because if you immediately go after the most controversial stuff, I think you are in danger of discrediting the whole idea.
This past weekend, I was in Florida speaking at a Tea Party organized, which had about 10,000 people there, some of whom were members of the Florida state legislature. One of whom told me that the president's bills, just a ballpark estimate, would add $1 billion in money that the state of Florida has to spend. They don't have it, so they have to raise taxes or do something to come up with the $1 billion. They can't print money the way the feds can. And I said to him, well, what would happen if you just don't spend it? I mean, what are the feds going to do? Send the military in here to force you to sign a check to draw money from a checking account that doesn't have the cash in it? And, of course, he didn't want to hear about any of that. Shades of the dictator Lincoln and the Civil War came to mind. But to be serious, What would the feds do if the states simply didn't spend the money that they don't have, that the feds have ordered them to spend?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, this is the huge question mark here. But if you've got several major states whose governors have conferred with each other and decided this is the stand we're going to take, we have enough public opinion in our states to back us up on it. We're all facing a fiscal crisis. The federal government, above all, I mean, it can't be lecturing other people about spending money. We've got to resist this for the sake of the welfare of our state. What would the federal government, in effect, do? Now, what it could try to do is try and cut off so-called federal funding for various projects to these states. But I think there are two answers to that. And one is, well, what if 25 states did it? I mean, are they really going to do that to 25 states and think that voters in those states aren't going to respond to that?
That I think is the key, Tom. As more and more states do this, I think it will really scare the daylights out of Congress. And medicinal marijuana may be an example. It was enforced under the Bush administration. We all know that terrible, horrible case that obliterates states' rights, Race against Gonzalez. But now, you find me praising the Obama administration, Tom. Now, at least in this area, they look the other way. I think they're looking the other way because of the overwhelming numbers of people who either want medicinal marijuana or want marijuana for recreational purposes. Put aside the virtues or lack thereof with respect to marijuana. It's a state sovereignty issue. And the more the feds realize there are people out there that think we're wrong, the more they might not necessarily change the law, but just not enforce it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so, too. And I think also as the years go on and the federal government's entitlement crisis begins to hit, and we may well have a currency crisis, it's going to have so many fish to fry that I think the states will be able to get away with more and more. You'll see charismatic governors coming up who realize that a career in Washington isn't necessarily the best approach to take when the currency's collapsing, and instead I can serve my ambition by being a governor who stands up to the federal government. I think you may begin to see things of that nature.
Let me throw a couple of ideas at you. Suppose the federal government refuses to have, suppose the state governments refuse to have their employees enforce federal law. We know that the feds do not have the manpower, person power, or resources to enforce federal law. So suppose in Montana, for example, the state, county, and local police and other governmental officials don't enforce federal law. Suppose they arrest federal agents who come in the state and violate state law. Can the states get away with things like that?
Well, I mean, I don't know about arresting federal agents. I mean, they did try and do stuff like that, as you say, in the 19th century. But you're right. What it boils down to, as with the marijuana case, is the federal government does not have the numbers, the ability, or even, frankly, in some cases, the willpower to carry through an attempt to overturn what uppity states like this might try to do.
I think the Real ID Act, which you also mentioned earlier, Tom, is a good one. The passion for that act, which was born out of totalitarian impulses in the Bush administration, might not exist in the federal government anymore. And thus, the states that have basically said we are not going to change our driver's licenses and make them into a national ID, which is basically what the Real ID Act does, basically can get away with that now because there's not the enthusiasm or the zeal in the federal government to enforce that.
Yeah, indeed. I think that is correct. They've sort of lost the stomach for some of this. I think the most important thing to be done right now, through education and through whatever channels we have, is to detoxify the idea of state powers, nullification, whatever, in the minds of people who still believe it's all about slavery. The history of the U.S. shows very much the opposite, that these ideas have been used on behalf of all kinds of causes, even causes we might associate with the left. There's no particular reason it should be associated with disreputable causes. And I mean, frankly, political centralization has made possible all the genocides of history. It's not exactly clear to me why we should be on the moral defensive.
Ronald Reagan